There are men who build nations with their hands, and there are men who build them with their hearts. George Washington was both. Before the monuments rose in his name, before his face was carved into stone and printed on currency, he was a boy who walked through orchards at dawn, a soldier who stood in freezing rivers, a general who wept for his men. He did not seek the crown of a king, yet he wore the weight of a country on his shoulders. In the quiet hours between dusk and sleep, his story unfolds not as legend, but as truth, a man who became the father of a nation not because he was perfect, but because he chose to serve when the world asked him to lead. Tonight, as the shadows lengthen and the world grows still, let us walk beside him through the fields of Virginia, through the smoke of revolution, through the halls where a republic was born. Let us remember that heroes are not born in marble, they are forged in doubt, in sacrifice, in the quiet courage of doing what is right even when the path is unclear. If these words carry you closer to sleep, let this channel stay by your side too. A gentle tap on subscribe means these stories will find you again, night after night, when the world is quiet and history feels close enough to touch. Let this voice be a companion in the dark, a thread that ties you to the past as you drift toward rest. The Potomac River moved slowly in the early morning, its surface catching the first light like scattered coins. A boy stood at its edge, barefoot in the mud, watching the water carry leaves and branches toward the bay. He was 11 years old, and his father had been dead for months. George Washington did not cry easily, but he had learned that grief is not always loud. Sometimes it is simply the weight of silence, the empty chair at dinner, the questions no one could answer anymore. Virginia in 1743 was a patchwork of plantations and wilderness, a place where families measured wealth in land and tobacco, where the future was something you inherited or carved out with your own hands. George's family had land, but not the kind of fortune that promised ease. His father, Augustine, had been a planter, a man of modest ambition who died too soon, leaving behind a widow and several children who suddenly had to navigate the world without him. George, the eldest son from Augustine's second marriage, felt the shift like a change in temperature. Childhood, whatever softness remained in it, began to harden into something else. His older half-brother Lawrence became a father figure, a guide through the uncertain terrain of adolescence. Lawrence had been to England, had served in the military, had seen a world beyond the rivers and forests of Virginia. He spoke of honor and duty, of the importance of character over inheritance. George listened with the intensity of a boy who needed direction, who wanted to become something worthy of the name he carried. Lawrence's estate, Mount Vernon, became a second home, a place of order and expectation, where George learned that manhood was not given, it was earned through discipline and action. But George was not a scholar in the traditional sense. Mathematics came easily to him, the logic of numbers and measurements, but the classics, the Latin and Greek that marked a gentleman's education, remained distant, languages spoken by a world he had not been invited to join. Instead, he turned his attention to the land itself, to the practical knowledge of surveying, of measuring boundaries and plotting distances. He learned to read the earth the way others read books, to understand slope and soil, to see in the wilderness not chaos, but patterns waiting to be mapped. At 15, he was hired to survey the Shenandoah Valley, a vast expanse of frontier land owned by Lord Fairfax, a connection made through Lawrence's marriage into the prominent Fairfax family. It was rough country, miles from anything resembling civilization, where men slept under stars and woke to the calls of animals they could not name. George traveled with a small crew, carrying chains and compasses, walking through forests so thick the sunlight barely reached the ground. He learned to navigate by instinct as much as instrument, to trust his eyes and his feet, to endure discomfort without complaint. The work was exhausting, but it was also clarifying. Out there, in the wilderness, social rank meant nothing. What mattered was whether you could do the job, whether you could be relied upon when the day grew long and the terrain turned difficult. George discovered that he was good at this, good at endurance, good at focus, good at the kind of steady, unglamorous labor that others found beneath them. He was tall for his age, broad-shouldered and strong, with a quietness that some mistook for aloofness but was really observation. He watched the men around him, learned who to trust and who to avoid, filed away lessons about human nature that would serve him for the rest of his life. When he returned from those surveying trips, covered in dust and smelling of wood smoke, he carried with him something more valuable than the money he had earned. He carried confidence. Not the loud, boastful kind, but the quiet assurance of someone who had tested himself and not been found wanting. He had walked into the wilderness as a boy and walked out as something closer to a man. The years that followed were a study in ambition tempered by circumstance. George Washington wanted to matter, wanted to rise above the modest station his birth had granted him, but the paths available to young men of his class were narrow. He could not afford university in England, could not claim the advantages his older half-brothers had enjoyed. What he could do was work, and so he did, surveying expeditions that took him deeper into the frontier, jobs that paid enough to begin acquiring his own land, small parcels at first, pieces of the future he was building acre by acre. But then Lawrence fell ill. Tuberculosis, they called it, a disease that hollowed men from the inside, that turned coughing into a constant companion and robbed the body of its strength. George watched his brother, his mentor, his model of what a man should be, grow thinner, paler, more fragile with each passing month. In the winter of 1751, Lawrence decided to travel to Barbados, hoping the warm Caribbean air might heal what Virginia's climate could not. He asked George to come with him, and George, who had never been beyond the colonies, agreed without hesitation. The voyage across the Atlantic was George's first glimpse of a world beyond the rivers and forests he had known. The ocean stretched in every direction, vast and indifferent, and the ship rose and fell with swells that made even experienced sailors grip the rails. George spent hours on deck, watching the horizon, feeling the spray of salt water on his face, marveling at the enormity of it all. When they finally reached Barbados, the island felt like a different planet, lush and green, the air thick with heat and the scent of unfamiliar flowers, people speaking in accents he struggled to understand. Lawrence's health did not improve. The warmth did nothing to silence the cough or restore the color to his face. George stayed by his side, helpless in the face of a disease that medicine could not touch. And then, as if the trip had not already been marked by sorrow, George himself fell ill. Smallpox swept through him like fire, covering his skin in pustules, burning with fever that made the days blur into delirium. He survived, but the disease left its signature, scars on his face that he would carry forever, faint reminders of mortality written into his skin. They returned to Virginia in early 1752, and by summer, Lawrence was dead. George, still only 20 years old, inherited Mount Vernon, the estate that would become his anchor, his home, the place he would return to again and again throughout a life that pulled him in 1,000 directions. He also inherited something less tangible but far more significant, a sense of duty, a feeling that he had been given something precious and was now responsible for protecting it, building upon it, making it worth the sacrifice of the man who had believed in him. He threw himself into the work of managing the estate, learning the rhythms of planting and harvest, the complexities of managing enslaved labor, a system he had been born into and did not yet question, a moral blindness that was common to his time and class but would cast a shadow over his legacy nonetheless. He expanded the house, improved the lands, experimented with crops beyond tobacco, always thinking ahead, always planning for a future that felt both uncertain and full of possibility. But ambition does not sleep, and Washington wanted more than the life of a planter. He wanted to serve, wanted to prove himself in a larger arena. In 1752, he applied for a position in the Virginia militia, and through a combination of family connections and his own growing reputation, he was commissioned as a major. He had no formal military training, no experience in command, but he had the qualities men look for in a leader: composure, physical presence, the kind of calm authority that makes others willing to follow. The frontier was a dangerous place in those years, a contested zone where the ambitions of empires collided with the lives of colonists and indigenous peoples caught between them. The French were pushing south from Canada, building forts in the Ohio Valley, claiming land that Virginia also considered its own. Tensions were rising, skirmishes breaking out in the wilderness, and the colonial government needed men willing to venture into that uncertainty and assert British interests. Washington volunteered. Not because he understood the full complexity of what was unfolding, but because he saw opportunity, the chance to distinguish himself, to earn the respect and advancement that came from service in dangerous times. In the autumn of 1753, he was given a mission that would test everything he had learned in the wilderness, travel deep into the Ohio country, find the French commanders, and deliver a message from the Virginia governor demanding they withdraw from lands claimed by the British Crown. It was a journey of hundreds of miles through territory that existed more as lines on maps than as anything resembling roads or settlements. Washington set out with a small party, a translator, a few frontiersmen who knew the forests, moving through late autumn rains that turned the ground to mud, through rivers swollen and dangerous, through forests where every shadow could hide friend or enemy. The cold came early that year, settling into the bones of the men who traveled through the wilderness like a weight they could not shake. Washington led his small party through forests where the trees grew so dense that daylight became a memory, where the only sounds were the crack of branches underfoot and the occasional call of birds they could not see. They moved carefully, aware that they were not alone in these woods, that the land belonged to the Iroquois and the Delaware, to the French who had built their forts along the rivers, to anyone strong enough to claim it. When they finally reached the French outposts, Washington delivered his message with all the formality his 21 years could muster. The French commander received him politely, offered wine and conversation, and then, with equal politeness, refused. The Ohio Valley was French, he explained, and would remain so. No letter from a colonial governor would change that. Washington understood then, perhaps for the first time, that words without power behind them were just noise carried away by the wind. The return journey was worse than the arrival. Winter had fully settled in, and the rivers they needed to cross had begun to freeze in jagged, unpredictable patterns. At one point, Washington and his guide attempted to cross the Allegheny River on a makeshift raft, only to have the ice smash into them with such force that Washington was thrown into the freezing water. He survived, pulled himself onto an island in the middle of the current, and spent the night soaked and shivering, watching his breath turn to frost in the air. It was the kind of moment that kills men, the kind of cold that stops the heart, but Washington woke the next morning, stiff and aching but alive, and continued the journey home. His report to the Virginia government was clear: the French would not leave willingly, and conflict was inevitable. The words were measured, but beneath them was the understanding of someone who had seen the edge of empire, who had stood in the wilderness and recognized that the map-makers and politicians had no idea what they were asking men to die for. Still, Washington had done his duty, and in doing so, he had earned a reputation. He was no longer just the surveyor, the young planter trying to make his way. He was becoming someone the colony could rely upon, someone who did not flinch when the task was difficult. In 1754, war came to the frontier in earnest. Washington, now a lieutenant colonel, was sent with a small force to reinforce British interests in the Ohio Valley. What followed was a series of events that would haunt him for years: a skirmish with a French patrol that ended in blood and confusion, accusations that Washington had ambushed the French during a diplomatic mission, the hasty construction of Fort Necessity in a meadow that seemed defensible until the rain came and turned it into a trap. The French and their indigenous allies surrounded the fort, and Washington found himself in command of men who were outnumbered, exhausted, and running low on ammunition. The rain fell in sheets, turning the ground to mud, filling the trenches where his men crouched and tried to keep their powder dry. The battle lasted through the day and into the night, musket fire crackling in the darkness, men dying in the wet and the cold, and Washington standing in the center of it all, trying to hold together a defense that was crumbling. By morning, he had no choice but to surrender. It was his first command in battle, and it had ended in defeat. The French allowed him and his men to leave, but Washington had to sign a document admitting fault, a confession written in French that he did not fully understand, words that would later be used to accuse him of murder, of starting a war through recklessness and ambition. He marched his men back to Virginia in silence, the weight of failure heavy on his shoulders, wondering if his career as a soldier had ended before it truly began. But failure, it turned out, was not the end. It was an education. Washington learned from Fort Necessity the lessons that no amount of training could teach, that courage without strategy is just waste, that leadership means knowing when to fight and when to retreat, that the lives of men are not abstractions but responsibilities that weigh on the conscience long after the battle ends. He also learned that reputation is fragile, that one mistake can undo years of careful work, and that the only way forward is to prove yourself again, to earn back trust through actions rather than words. The frontier war continued, and Washington continued with it. He served under British General Edward Braddock in 1755, part of a massive expedition to capture Fort Duquesne from the French. Braddock was a professional soldier, trained in European warfare, confident in the superiority of British discipline and tactics. Washington tried to warn him that the wilderness was different, that the enemy would not stand in neat lines to be shot, but Braddock dismissed the concerns of a colonial officer with no formal training. The ambush came on a hot July day, the French and their indigenous allies attacking from the cover of trees, pouring fire into the British column that had no room to maneuver, no way to form the defensive lines their training had prepared them for. Men fell by the dozens, panic spreading like a fire through dry grass, and Braddock himself was shot from his horse, mortally wounded. Washington, though ill with fever, rode through the chaos trying to organize a retreat, 2 horses shot out from under him, his coat torn by bullets that somehow missed flesh. He helped carry the dying Braddock from the field, and in the days that followed, as the general slipped toward death, Washington saw again the brutal truth that war does not care about rank or experience or confidence, it only cares about who survives and who does not. And so the boy who had stood by the river, who had learned to measure the earth, who had wanted nothing more than to prove himself worthy, he became a soldier. Not through glory, but through survival. Not through victory, but through the slow, painful accumulation of lessons written in blood and loss. The wilderness does not care about your plans. It does not yield to maps or orders or the confidence of men who believe they understand it. George Washington learned this truth in the years following Braddock's defeat, when the frontier became a place where survival was measured in days, where the line between civilization and chaos was as thin as the wall of a wooden stockade. He was 23 years old and already carried the weight of command, the knowledge that decisions made in haste could mean the difference between life and death for men who trusted him to know better. Virginia's governor appointed him colonel of the Virginia Regiment, tasking him with the impossible job of defending hundreds of miles of frontier with a force that never numbered more than a few hundred men. The settlers scattered across the backcountry looked to him for protection, but there were not enough soldiers, not enough supplies, not enough of anything except fear and the constant threat of raids that came without warning and left only silence and smoke in their wake. Washington established his headquarters at Fort Loudon in Winchester, a town that had become a refuge for families fleeing the violence. They arrived in wagons loaded with whatever they could carry, children clinging to their mothers, men with haunted eyes who had seen their neighbors killed, their homes burned. Washington tried to help them, tried to stretch his meager resources to provide some measure of safety, but the mathematics were cruel. He could not be everywhere at once, could not protect every isolated cabin, every vulnerable settlement. People died, and he carried the weight of each loss like stones in his pockets. He wrote letters constantly, to the governor, to the colonial assembly, pleading for more men, more funds, more support. His words grew sharper with frustration, the polite deference of a young officer giving way to the blunt insistence of someone who had seen too much death to care about propriety. He needed soldiers who would stay beyond their brief enlistments, needed discipline and training, needed the tools to build a force that could actually defend the frontier rather than simply bear witness to its suffering. But Washington was also learning to lead, and leadership in the wilderness was different from anything the manuals described. It meant riding through the night to reach a threatened fort, meant sharing the same rations as the men under his command, meant making decisions with incomplete information and living with the consequences. He was tall and imposing, his physical presence alone commanding attention, but it was his steadiness that men came to rely on, the sense that Washington would not panic, would not abandon them, would face whatever came with the same grim determination he expected from them. He learned, too, the complexities of the world he was trying to protect. The frontier was not simply a line between British civilization and French aggression. It was home to indigenous nations who had their own interests, their own alliances, their own reasons for fighting. The Iroquois, the Shawnee, the Delaware, they were not merely allies or enemies, but peoples navigating the collision of empires, trying to preserve their lands and ways of life in a world that was changing with terrifying speed. Washington's understanding of this was limited by his time and his perspective, shaped by the belief that British expansion was not just inevitable but right. It was a blindness he shared with his contemporaries, a failure to see that the land he was fighting for belonged to others long before any European drew a map. The raids continued through 1756 and into 1757, a grinding war of ambush and counter-ambush, of small victories and larger frustrations. Washington pushed his men hard, enforced discipline with a strictness that earned him respect but not always affection. He ordered floggings for desertion, court-martials for insubordination, believing that without order, the regiment would collapse into a mob. It was harsh, but the frontier was harsher, and Washington had no patience for anything that weakened the fragile structure holding his force together. In the quiet moments, when the day's work was done and the reports were written, Washington allowed himself to think about the future beyond the wilderness. He had proven himself as a soldier, but he did not want to spend his life in these forests, defending a frontier that seemed to have no end. He thought of Mount Vernon, of the life he had left behind, of the possibility of marriage and family, of becoming the kind of gentleman planter his brother Lawrence had been. But duty kept him in place, kept him riding through the rain and the cold, kept him writing letters and training men and carrying the burden of command through years that felt longer than they were. Then, in 1758, everything changed. The British government, stung by years of defeats, committed real resources to the war in North America. General John Forbes arrived with thousands of troops and a plan to finally capture Fort Duquesne, the French stronghold that had been the source of so much bloodshed. Washington and his Virginia regiment were assigned to the expedition, and for the first time, Washington found himself part of a force large enough to actually accomplish something. The march toward Fort Duquesne was slow and methodical, nothing like the reckless advance that had led to Braddock's disaster. General Forbes was cautious, building roads as he went, establishing supply lines, fortifying positions before moving forward. Washington chafed at the pace, his impatience barely concealed in his correspondence. He had been fighting in these woods for years, had learned their dangers through experience and loss, and now he had to watch British regulars inch their way forward as if time meant nothing. But Forbes was right to be careful. The wilderness had claimed enough lives through haste and arrogance. The army moved like a deliberate beast, clearing trees, hauling cannon through mud, building a road that would remain long after the war had ended. Washington rode with the Virginia troops, his men hardened by years of frontier service, and he felt the strange mixture of anticipation and dread that comes before a battle that has been waiting too long to arrive. In November, as autumn gave way to early winter, the army finally approached Fort Duquesne. Washington expected a fight, expected the French to defend their stronghold with the same ferocity they had shown at every other encounter. But when the advance scouts reached the fort, they found it abandoned, burning. The French, outnumbered and cut off from reinforcements, had destroyed what they could not hold and retreated north into the gathering winter. The Ohio Valley, after years of bloodshed, had fallen to the British without a final shot fired. Washington stood in the ruins of the fort, smoke still rising from charred timbers, and felt the strange emptiness of a victory that had cost everything to reach and nothing to claim. The men cheered, celebrated the capture of the position they had fought for so long, but Washington was already thinking beyond the moment. The war would continue elsewhere, the conflict between empires was far from over, but his part in it, this brutal, grinding frontier campaign, was finished. He resigned his commission in December 1758, returning to Mount Vernon with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had proven himself but was also profoundly tired. He was 26 years old and had seen more death and hardship than many men see in a lifetime. The scars were not all visible, they lived in his memory, in the faces of men who had died under his command, in the failures and frustrations that had taught him what leadership truly meant. At Mount Vernon, Washington tried to build the life he had deferred. In January 1759, he married Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy widow with 2 young children. It was not a passionate romance in the poetic sense, but something deeper and more practical, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and the understanding that they could build something meaningful together. Martha brought to the marriage considerable wealth, lands, and enslaved people that expanded Washington's holdings significantly. She also brought stability, a domestic life that Washington had craved during the long years of military service. He became a planter in earnest, managing his estates with the same attention to detail he had applied to military matters. He experimented with crops, rotated fields, tried to make the land more productive and sustainable. He was meticulous in his record-keeping, noting every expense, every harvest, every transaction in ledgers that revealed a mind constantly calculating, planning, optimizing. He served in the Virginia House of Burgesses, representing his county, learning the rhythms of politics and debate, building relationships with the men who shaped colonial society. For more than 15 years, Washington lived this life, a gentleman planter, a member of Virginia's elite, a man whose military service seemed to belong to a younger, more turbulent past. He expanded Mount Vernon, adding rooms and refining its architecture, turning it into a statement of taste and success. He entertained guests, rode to hounds, attended church, played the role that his class and his achievements had prepared him for. From the outside, it looked like contentment, like a man who had found his place in the world and was satisfied to remain there. But beneath the surface, tensions were building, tensions that would eventually pull Washington back into a world he thought he had left behind. The relationship between the colonies and Britain was changing, souring over taxes and representation, over the fundamental question of what it meant to be British subjects living 3,000 miles from the seat of power. The Stamp Act of 1765 provoked outrage, protests in the streets, a sense that Parliament was overstepping bounds that had previously been understood if not formally defined. Washington, like many of his fellow planters, felt the sting of policies that seemed designed to extract wealth from the colonies without giving them a voice in the decisions that affected their lives. He was not a radical, not initially. Washington was a man of order, of tradition, someone who believed in working within established systems. But he was also deeply practical, and he could see the trajectory of British policy leading toward a confrontation that no one seemed able or willing to prevent. He attended meetings of the House of Burgesses where the debates grew heated, where men who had been loyal subjects began to speak of rights and liberties in tones that suggested they might be willing to fight for them. The Boston Tea Party in 1773 was a turning point, a dramatic rejection of British authority that thrilled some and horrified others. Washington's response was measured. He disapproved of the destruction of property, believed the colonists should have found a less provocative way to make their point, but he also understood the anger that had driven them to it. When Parliament responded with the coercive acts, punishing Massachusetts with measures that seemed designed to break colonial resistance through intimidation, Washington's patience began to wear thin. By 1774, the question was no longer whether the colonies would resist, but how far that resistance would go. Virginia's leaders called for a Continental Congress, a gathering of delegates from across the colonies to coordinate a response to British policies that had become intolerable. Washington was chosen as one of Virginia's representatives, and in September, he traveled to Philadelphia to join men from colonies he had never visited, to discuss a future none of them could fully imagine. Philadelphia was larger than any city Washington had known, bustling with commerce and ideas, a place where the different rhythms of colonial life converged into something that felt almost like a nation, though no one dared speak that word aloud yet. The delegates met at Carpenter's Hall, men of varying temperaments and convictions, radicals from Massachusetts who had already tasted British violence, moderates who still hoped for reconciliation, conservatives who feared that resistance would lead to ruin. Washington sat quietly through most of the debates, listening more than speaking, his presence itself a statement. He arrived in military uniform, the same uniform he had worn as colonel of the Virginia Regiment, and everyone understood the message. He was prepared to fight if fighting became necessary. The Congress produced petitions and agreements, declarations of rights and boycotts of British goods, carefully worded documents that tried to walk the line between asserting colonial liberties and avoiding outright rebellion. Washington signed them, supported them, but he was not naive about where this was leading. He wrote to a friend that the crisis could end in one of two ways: either Britain would relent, or the colonies would have to defend themselves with arms. There was no middle ground left, no compromise that would satisfy both the principle of liberty and the demands of an empire that seemed determined to assert its authority regardless of the cost. He returned to Mount Vernon in late autumn, and the months that followed had the strange quality of waiting for a storm everyone could see gathering on the horizon. Washington drilled the local militia, ordered military supplies, prepared for a war he hoped would not come but believed was inevitable. Martha watched him with concern, understanding that the life they had built together, the peace they had found, was about to be shattered by forces neither of them could control. In April 1775, the storm broke. British troops marched on Lexington and Concord, attempting to seize colonial military supplies, and the militia met them with gunfire. Men died on both sides, and by the time the British retreated to Boston, they left behind a trail of bodies and a conflict that could no longer be contained by words or petitions. The news reached Virginia within days, carried by riders who had barely stopped to rest, and Washington knew immediately that everything had changed. The Second Continental Congress convened in May, and the atmosphere was completely different from the cautious deliberations of the previous year. War had begun, and now the question was not whether to resist but how to organize that resistance into something that could survive against the most powerful military force in the world. The delegates needed a commander for the Continental Army, someone who could unite troops from different colonies, someone with military experience and the respect of his peers. John Adams of Massachusetts proposed George Washington of Virginia. It was a political calculation as much as a military one. Choosing a Southerner to lead an army defending New England would bind the colonies together, would make this a truly continental effort rather than a regional squabble. But it was also recognition of something Adams had seen in Washington, a quality of steadiness, of reliable competence, of someone who could be trusted with enormous responsibility and would not use it for personal gain. Washington was not in the room when the vote was taken. He had stepped outside, perhaps sensing what was coming and wanting to avoid the appearance of seeking the position. When he returned and learned he had been chosen, he stood before the Congress and accepted with words that revealed both his sense of duty and his genuine doubt. He did not feel equal to the command, he said. He would accept no salary, only reimbursement for expenses. He would do his utmost, but he could not guarantee success. It was the response of a man who understood the weight of what he was being asked to carry, who had learned in the wilderness that confidence without humility is just arrogance waiting to be punished. On June 23, 1775, Washington rode out of Philadelphia toward Boston, where a makeshift army of colonial militia had trapped the British forces inside the city. He was 43 years old, leaving behind the life he loved for a war he had not wanted, accepting command of an army that barely existed to fight an empire that had never been defeated. He did not know if he would survive, did not know if the cause he was serving would end in independence or in executions for treason. He only knew that he had been called, and that he would answer, because that is what duty demanded and what honor required. The road to Boston stretched before him, and beyond it, a war that would test everything he had learned, everything he believed, everything he was. The boy who had stood by the river watching the water flow toward an unknown future had become a general riding toward a destiny that would reshape the world. And though he could not see the end of the road, he rode forward anyway, steady and resolute, carrying the hopes of a people who had decided that freedom was worth the cost of blood. The army waiting for Washington outside Boston was not an army in any sense he understood. It was a gathering of farmers and shopkeepers, of boys who had never fired a shot in anger and old men who remembered wars from decades past. They had muskets, most of them, and the courage born of anger, but they had no uniforms, no organization, no supply system, no discipline. They were camped in a loose ring around the city, thousands of men from different colonies who barely trusted each other, led by officers elected by their own troops who saw military hierarchy as just another form of the tyranny they were fighting against. Washington rode through the camps in early July, taking the measure of what he had been given to work with, and the reality settled over him like a cold weight. These men had heart, they had driven the British back from Lexington and Concord, had held their ground at Bunker Hill even as regulars in red coats charged up the slope with bayonets fixed. But heart alone would not win a war against an empire. He needed to transform this gathering into something that could stand in formation, that could maneuver under fire, that could endure the brutal calculus of sustained conflict where enthusiasm fades and only discipline keeps men from breaking. He established headquarters in Cambridge, a commandeered house that became the center of an operation that felt overwhelming in its complexity. He needed to organize regiments, appoint officers, establish chains of command. He needed supplies, powder and shot, tents and blankets, food for thousands of men who ate through provisions faster than they could be replenished. He needed intelligence about British strength and intentions, needed to know how many troops they had, how they were deployed, what they might be planning. And he needed to do all of this while maintaining a siege of Boston with an army that technically only existed until the end of the year, when enlistments expired and men could simply walk home if they chose. The challenges were immense, but Washington approached them with the methodical determination that had defined his entire life. He imposed discipline with a firmness that shocked men accustomed to the loose democracy of militia service. He ordered courts-martial for theft and desertion, floggings for drunkenness and insubordination. He banned gambling, tried to reduce profanity, insisted on sanitation measures that many considered unnecessary until disease began killing more men than British bullets ever would. He was not cruel, but he was unyielding in his belief that an army without discipline was just a mob waiting to scatter at the first real test. Some men resented him for it, complained that he acted like an aristocrat, that he did not understand the common soldier. But others saw in his strictness a kind of respect. He was treating them like real soldiers, like men capable of becoming something more than they had been. And Washington, for his part, was learning to see past his own prejudices. These were not the professional soldiers he had imagined leading. They were citizens, volunteers who had left their farms and shops to fight for something they believed in. If he could forge them into an effective force, it would not be by making them British regulars, but by creating something new, an army of free men who chose to fight rather than men who fought because they were ordered to. The siege of Boston dragged through the summer and into autumn, a strange stalemate where two armies watched each other across earthworks and waited. Washington grew frustrated with the inaction, proposed bold plans to storm the city that his officers gently talked him out of, recognizing what Washington in his impatience sometimes forgot, that they could not afford the casualties such an assault would cost. They were not fighting for territory but for time, for the space to build an army and a cause, to prove that colonial resistance could sustain itself beyond the first flush of anger. In November, Washington learned that the British had no intention of leaving Boston voluntarily. General William Howe, now in command of British forces, was reinforcing the garrison, preparing to hold the city through winter. Washington needed something to break the deadlock, some advantage that would force the British hand. The answer came from an unlikely source, a plan proposed by Henry Knox, a young bookseller turned artillery officer, to retrieve the cannons captured at Fort Ticonderoga and drag them 300 miles through winter to Boston. It seemed impossible, the kind of scheme that looks mad on paper and madder in execution. But Washington approved it, because impossible was better than nothing, and in December, Knox set out with a team of men and oxen to do what should not have been possible. Through ice and snow, across frozen rivers and through mountain passes, they hauled dozens of cannons weighing thousands of pounds, a logistical feat that matched anything the professional British military could have accomplished. The cannons arrived in Cambridge in late January 1776, iron and bronze proof that determination could overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable. Washington immediately began planning how to use them, studying the maps of Boston and its surroundings, looking for high ground that could command the city and the harbor. His eyes kept returning to Dorchester Heights, a position south of Boston that overlooked everything, the city, the British ships, the routes in and out. If he could fortify those heights and place Knox's cannons there, the British would have to either attack uphill against entrenched artillery or evacuate the city entirely. The plan required moving thousands of men and tons of equipment in a single night, building fortifications in darkness while British sentries watched for any sign of activity. It was the kind of gamble Washington had learned to take, the kind of calculated risk that could win or lose everything in a few hours. On the night of March 4th, under cover of darkness and a diversionary bombardment, his men moved on to Dorchester Heights with wagons full of pre-assembled fortifications, barrels filled with stones that could be rolled down the slopes at attacking troops, and the precious cannons that had traveled so far to reach this moment. By dawn, the fortifications stood complete, and the British woke to find themselves staring up at American artillery commanding their entire position. General Howe prepared to attack, sent troops loading into boats for an assault that would have been bloody for both sides, but then the weather intervened. A storm swept in, wind so fierce that landing boats could not navigate, rain that turned the slopes to mud. By the time the weather cleared, Howe had made his decision. He would not waste lives attacking a position that had already been lost. The British would evacuate Boston. On March 17, 1776, Washington watched from those heights as British ships loaded with troops and Loyalist refugees sailed out of Boston Harbor, leaving behind a city that had been under occupation since the war began. It was his first real victory, achieved not through battle but through maneuver, through patience and planning and the willingness to take a risk when the moment presented itself. The people of Boston celebrated, crowds gathering in streets they had not been free to walk, and Washington allowed himself a moment of satisfaction before turning his mind to what came next. Because he knew what came next. The British had not surrendered, had not given up. They had simply relocated, and they would return with more men, more ships, more determination to crush a rebellion that had now cost them one of their key positions in North America. Washington had to anticipate where they would strike next, had to move his army to meet threats he could only guess at, had to continue building a military force from materials that seemed to dissolve and reform with each passing month as enlistments ended and new recruits arrived. He moved the army to New York in the spring, recognizing that the city's strategic position, its harbor, its rivers, its role as a gateway between New England and the southern colonies, made it the logical next target for British forces. New York was harder to defend than Boston, spread across islands and peninsulas, with waterways that British ships could navigate at will. But it had to be defended, or at least the attempt had to be made, because abandoning it without a fight would be a blow to morale that the fragile cause of independence could not afford. While his army fortified positions around New York, Congress in Philadelphia was moving toward a decision that would change everything. Through the spring and early summer of 1776, delegates debated the question that no one had wanted to ask directly: should the colonies declare themselves independent states, separate from Britain entirely, or should they continue to frame their resistance as a fight for rights within the British system? The radicals pushed for independence, argued that reconciliation was impossible, that the fighting had already made them enemies of the crown and the only path forward was to embrace that reality and declare it openly. On July 4, 1776, Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, a document that transformed rebellion into revolution, that staked everything on the proposition that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed and that people have the right to alter or abolish governments that become destructive of their liberties. When the news reached New York, Washington had it read to the assembled troops, and they cheered and tore down a statue of King George III, melting it down for musket balls in a symbolic act that captured the moment's significance. But symbols do not win wars, and Washington knew that the real test was just beginning. In August, British ships appeared in New York Harbor, not a few vessels, but a fleet unlike anything the Americans had seen, carrying an army of 32,000 men, professional soldiers supported by Hessian mercenaries hired from German princes. General Howe had returned, and this time he brought overwhelming force, the kind of military power that could crush the Continental Army if Washington made a single major mistake. The battle for New York began on Long Island in late August, and it was a disaster from the start. British and Hessian troops outmaneuvered the American positions, attacking from unexpected directions, using their superior training and numbers to devastating effect. Washington watched from across the East River as his lines collapsed, as men who had stood bravely at first broke and ran when the weight of the assault became too much to bear. By nightfall, thousands of American troops were trapped on Brooklyn Heights with their backs to the river, surrounded on three sides by an enemy that would surely finish them in the morning. Washington made a decision that saved the army and possibly the entire revolution. Under cover of darkness and fog, he organized a retreat across the East River, evacuating 9,000 men in a single night using every boat that could be found. It was a miraculous feat of logistics and discipline, soldiers moving in near silence while British campfires burned just beyond the ridgeline. By dawn, the last boat pushed off from shore, and the British found empty fortifications where an army had been trapped just hours before. But the retreat did not end there. Through September and October, Washington pulled his forces back through Manhattan, fighting delaying actions at Harlem Heights and White Plains, trying to preserve his army while the British systematically occupied New York. The losses were heavy, men captured, supplies abandoned, morale crumbling as victory after victory went to the enemy. The revolution that had seemed so full of possibility in July looked like it was dying before autumn ended. In November, Washington made the agonizing decision to abandon Fort Washington in northern Manhattan, hoping to save the garrison there, but the commander on the ground disobeyed the order and tried to hold the position. The British stormed the fort and captured nearly 3,000 men, the single largest loss of the war to that point. Washington watched from across the Hudson River as the fort fell, watched his men march into captivity, and the weight of it pressed down on him like a physical thing. This was his responsibility, his command, and he was watching it crumble. He retreated across New Jersey through late November and early December, the British pursuing but never quite catching him, Washington burning bridges behind his army to slow the chase. His force shrank with each passing day, men whose enlistments expired simply went home, exhausted by defeat and convinced the cause was lost. Those who remained were hungry, cold, many without shoes, leaving bloody footprints in the snow. They crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania just ahead of the pursuing British, and Washington ordered every boat for miles collected on the Pennsylvania side so the enemy could not follow. It was early December 1776, and the revolution was dying. Congress had fled Philadelphia, fearing British capture. The army numbered fewer than 3,000 effective troops. Enlistments would expire at year's end, and most men planned to go home. The British were settling into winter quarters in New Jersey, confident that spring would bring the final campaign to crush the rebellion once and for all. Washington sat in his headquarters on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware, reading reports that all said the same thing: the cause was lost unless something dramatic happened, and happened soon. Thomas Paine had just published The Crisis, words meant to rally a faltering revolution. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country, but he that stands by it now, deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Washington read those words and felt their truth, but he also knew that words alone would not save the revolution. Action would. Bold, unexpected action that could shift momentum, that could remind his men and the country that this war was not over. He studied his maps, looking at the British positions across the Delaware. They were scattered, confident, celebrating the coming Christmas holiday with no expectation of American attack in winter weather. And in that confidence, Washington saw opportunity. On Christmas night, 1776, he would do the impossible again. He would cross the Delaware in winter darkness, march through freezing rain to attack the Hessian garrison at Trenton, and stake everything on a single desperate gamble. Because sometimes, when all seems lost, the only option left is to risk what little remains on the chance that courage and surprise can accomplish what strength and numbers cannot. The boats were gathered, the plans made in secrecy, and as Christmas night approached, Washington prepared to lead his starving, freezing army back across the river toward an enemy that had no reason to expect them. The boy who had crossed rivers as a surveyor, the soldier who had survived ambush and defeat, the general who had learned that wars are won not by never falling but by standing up again each time you fall, he was about to make a crossing that would change everything. And on the far shore, in the cold darkness of a winter night, history waited to be written in ice and blood and the stubborn refusal to accept defeat. The boats cut through black water thick with ice, each stroke of the oars a muffled sound swallowed by the darkness and the wind. Snow had begun to fall, mixing with sleet that stung exposed skin, and the men huddled in the boats were silent, each lost in his own thoughts about what waited on the far shore. Washington stood in the lead boat, his tall frame unmistakable even in the darkness, watching the New Jersey shore materialize slowly from the winter night. It was nearly midnight on Christmas, and they were hours behind schedule, the crossing taking far longer than planned as ice choked the river and the weather worsened. They reached the shore and disembarked, men stumbling on frozen ground, regrouping in the darkness as more boats arrived behind them. Washington had planned to attack before dawn, to catch the Hessians sleeping off their Christmas celebrations, but the delays meant they would be marching in daylight, losing the advantage of surprise. A lesser commander might have called it off, turned back across the river to safety. But Washington understood that this moment was not about tactics anymore, it was about survival, about proving that the revolution still had breath in it, still had the will to fight. They marched through the night toward Trenton, 9 miles of frozen road where the sleet turned to snow and the wind cut through threadbare uniforms. Men wrapped rags around their feet where shoes had worn through, left trails of blood in the snow, but they kept moving because Washington kept moving, because his presence at the front of the column was a constant reminder that whatever they suffered, he suffered too. 2 men froze to death on that march, collapsed and did not rise, but the column pushed forward. As dawn broke gray and cold, they reached the outskirts of Trenton. Washington split his force, sending one column to attack from the north and another from the west, a coordinated assault that depended on timing and luck and the hope that the Hessians would be unprepared. The first shots rang out, musket fire crackling through the winter morning, and then the American artillery opened up, cannons firing down the streets of Trenton, and suddenly the disciplined attack became chaos as Hessians poured from their quarters trying to form defensive lines. The battle lasted less than an hour. The Hessians, caught completely by surprise, tried to organize a defense but were overwhelmed by Americans attacking from multiple directions. Some Hessians fought hard, professional soldiers doing their duty even in impossible circumstances, but more surrendered as they realized resistance was futile. By mid-morning, it was over. Nearly 1,000 Hessians captured, their supplies and weapons taken, and the Americans had suffered fewer than a dozen casualties. Washington stood in the town square as prisoners were marched past, and for the first time in months, he allowed himself to feel something like hope. This was not a major battle in strategic terms, not a crushing defeat of British forces. But it was victory after months of retreat and loss, proof that the Continental Army could still fight, could still win. Word of Trenton spread quickly, to the Congress that had fled Philadelphia, to the people who had begun to doubt whether resistance was possible, to the men whose enlistments were about to expire and who might now be convinced to stay. Washington did not rest. He knew the British would respond, would send forces to retake Trenton and punish the Americans for their audacity. He needed to keep momentum, to strike again before the enemy could recover. A week later, he attacked Princeton, another sharp engagement where American troops drove British regulars from the field, another victory that seemed impossible given the state of the army just weeks before. And then, having done what he set out to do, having revived the revolution through sheer determination and calculated risk, Washington led his army into winter quarters at Morristown in the hills of northern New Jersey. The winter at Morristown was brutal, the cold relentless, supplies scarce, but the army survived because it had something it had not had before, the memory of victories, the knowledge that they could win. Men whose enlistments had expired chose to stay, and new recruits arrived, drawn by the news of Trenton and Princeton. The revolution, which had seemed dead in December, was alive in January, and Washington had given it that gift through a single night's crossing of a frozen river. But the war was far from over. The British still held New York and much of New Jersey, still commanded the seas, still had resources and manpower that dwarfed anything the Americans could muster. The fighting continued through 1777, a campaign that would test Washington again, that would bring victories at Brandywine and Germantown offset by the British capture of Philadelphia, that would end with the Continental Army shivering through another winter at Valley Forge while Congress debated and doubted and some even whispered that perhaps Washington should be replaced by a more aggressive commander. Valley Forge was a place that tested souls. The army arrived in December 1777, exhausted from months of marching and fighting, and settled into a plateau of frozen ground 18 miles from Philadelphia, where the British spent the winter in comfort while Americans built crude huts from logs and mud. There were never enough supplies, blankets, clothes, food arrived sporadically or not at all, and men wrapped themselves in whatever they could find to survive nights when the temperature fell below freezing and stayed there. Washington walked through the camp and saw suffering that no orders could alleviate. Men with feet wrapped in bloody rags because they had no shoes. Men sharing single blankets between 2 or 3 because there were not enough to go around. Men subsisting on fire cake, flour and water baked on stones, because meat was a memory and even bread was scarce. Disease moved through the camp like a slow fire, typhoid and dysentery and pneumonia killing men that British bullets had missed. By the time winter ended, more than 2,000 soldiers would be dead, not from battle but from cold and hunger and sickness. Washington wrote letter after letter to Congress, pleading for supplies, for money, for anything that could ease the suffering of men who had given everything for a cause that seemed to be forgetting them. His words grew desperate, the careful politeness of earlier correspondence giving way to blunt warnings that the army would dissolve if help did not come. But Congress, operating from York where they had fled when Philadelphia fell, was fractured and ineffective, different factions arguing over strategy and blame while the army slowly starved. There were plots against Washington that winter, whispers among some officers and politicians that perhaps he was not the right commander, that his defensive strategy was too cautious, that someone bolder might have already won the war. The Conway Cabal, as it came to be known, was more rumor than organized conspiracy, but it revealed the fragility of Washington's position. He commanded not by royal appointment but by the consent of Congress, and that consent could be withdrawn if enough powerful men decided he had failed. Washington weathered the criticism with the same grim determination he applied to everything else. He did not defend himself publicly, did not engage in political maneuvering to protect his position. He simply continued to do the work, training the army, maintaining discipline, holding together a force that had every reason to break apart. And slowly, as winter gave way to spring, supplies began to arrive. Not enough, never enough, but sufficient to keep men alive and fighting. Something else arrived at Valley Forge that transformed the Continental Army, a Prussian officer named Friedrich von Steuben, who volunteered to train American troops in the European methods of warfare. Washington gave him free rein, and von Steuben drilled the men relentlessly, teaching them to march in formation, to maneuver as units, to load and fire with the speed and precision of professional soldiers. The Americans learned, and in learning became something they had not been before, an army that could stand in open battle against British regulars without breaking. By the time the army marched out of Valley Forge in June 1778, they were leaner, harder, more disciplined than the force that had stumbled into winter quarters 6 months earlier. They had survived something that should have killed them, and in surviving had proven that the revolution could endure whatever was thrown against it. The British, sensing the shift in momentum, abandoned Philadelphia and retreated toward New York, and Washington followed, looking for an opportunity to strike. That opportunity came at Monmouth Courthouse in New Jersey, where the Continental Army engaged British forces in brutal summer heat that killed more men from exhaustion than bullets. The battle was technically a draw, but it felt like a victory because the Americans had stood toe-to-toe with British regulars and held their ground. Washington himself rode into the battle when his forward units began to retreat without orders, rallying men through sheer presence, cursing in language that shocked soldiers who had never heard their commander lose composure, driving them back into the fight through force of will. The war ground on through 1779 and into 1780, shifting south as the British opened a new theater in the Carolinas, hoping to rally loyalist support and crush the rebellion from a different direction. Washington remained in the north, containing British forces in New York, but he sent troops south under commanders like Nathaniel Greene who fought a guerrilla campaign that bled British strength through endless small engagements and strategic retreats that never quite became defeats. And then, in 1780, came the betrayal that wounded Washington more deeply than any military setback. Benedict Arnold, one of his most talented generals, a man Washington had trusted and defended, sold military secrets to the British and attempted to surrender West Point, the key American fortress on the Hudson River. The plot was discovered before it could succeed, but Arnold escaped to British lines, and Washington was left to execute the British spy who had served as Arnold's contact, a young officer named John Andre whom Washington personally liked but could not spare because treason demanded a response that was absolute. Washington wept in private over Arnold's betrayal, the pain of it cutting deeper than he showed in public. It was a reminder that even in a cause as righteous as independence, human nature remained flawed, that ambition and resentment could corrupt even the brave. But he could not afford to dwell on it, could not let personal pain interfere with the war that still needed to be won. By 1781, the war had settled into a rhythm of exhaustion. 6 years of fighting had drained both sides, stretched resources and willpower to breaking points that somehow never quite broke. Washington's army remained in the north, watching the British in New York, while in the south, British General Cornwallis chased American forces through the Carolinas in a campaign that was winning battles but losing the war. Every victory for Cornwallis came at a cost his army could not afford, bleeding men and supplies in a countryside that refused to be pacified. Washington waited, knowing that the key to winning was not to defeat the British in every engagement but to outlast them, to make the war so costly and so prolonged that Britain would eventually decide that holding the colonies was not worth the price. It was not a strategy that satisfied those who wanted dramatic victories, but it was realistic, grounded in the mathematical truth that America had more will than Britain had resources to break it. In the late summer of 1781, the opportunity Washington had been waiting for finally materialized. Cornwallis, exhausted from his southern campaign, moved his army to Yorktown on the Virginia coast, planning to establish a base where British ships could supply and reinforce him. But the French, who had allied with America in 1778 and whose fleet had been operating in Caribbean waters, sent word that their ships were sailing north and could potentially trap Cornwallis if Washington could move his army south quickly enough. It was the kind of convergence that wars turn on, the right enemy position, the right allied support, the right timing. Washington made the decision immediately. He would leave a holding force to watch New York and march the bulk of his army south to Virginia, coordinating with French forces under General Rochambeau for a combined assault on Cornwallis. It was a gamble, a march of hundreds of miles that would leave New York exposed, but Washington understood that opportunities like this did not come twice. The march south was a feat of logistics and deception. Washington fed false intelligence to the British, making them believe he was preparing to attack New York, then moved his army so quickly that the British did not realize what was happening until it was too late. French and American troops converged on Virginia in September, and the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse arrived in Chesapeake Bay, defeating a British relief fleet and sealing off Cornwallis's escape route by sea. Cornwallis was trapped. His army of 8,000 men was surrounded by a combined French and American force twice that size, cut off from supplies, from reinforcements, from any hope of relief. Washington directed the siege with meticulous care, establishing artillery positions, moving trenches closer to British lines, maintaining a steady pressure that gave Cornwallis no option but to wait and hope for rescue that would not come. On October 19, 1781, after days of bombardment and with his position hopeless, Cornwallis surrendered. The British army marched out of their fortifications to lay down their weapons while the Continental Army and their French allies watched in formation, and a band played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down," a melody that captured the impossibility of what had just happened. A colonial rebellion had defeated the British Empire. Washington stood watching the surrender, his face composed, his emotions held in check as they had been through so many years of struggle. This was not technically the end of the war, there would be more fighting, more negotiations, more months of uncertainty, but everyone present understood that this was the moment that decided it. Britain would not send another army, would not continue a war that had already cost so much for so little gain. The revolution had won, not through a single decisive battle, but through endurance, through the stubborn refusal to give up even when defeat seemed certain. In the months that followed Yorktown, the nature of Washington's role began to shift. He was no longer just a military commander but a symbol, the embodiment of the revolution's success, the man who had held the army together through years when it should have collapsed. People spoke of him with reverence that made him uncomfortable, compared him to classical heroes, suggested that he deserved to rule the nation he had helped create. And that was exactly what Washington feared. He had fought to escape the tyranny of kings, had watched men die for the principle that governments should serve the people rather than the other way around. The last thing he wanted was to become another form of the same oppression they had overthrown. When some of his officers suggested in 1783 that he should use the army to pressure Congress for better treatment, perhaps even seize power himself, Washington rejected the idea with a firmness that bordered on anger. He addressed his officers at Newburgh, New York, in March 1783, speaking to men who were frustrated by Congress's failure to pay them, who felt they had been forgotten by the government they had fought to create. Washington acknowledged their grievances, understood their anger, but told them that military power should never dictate to civilian authority, that to do so would betray everything they had fought for. It was one of the most important speeches he ever gave, a moment when he could have become a dictator and chose instead to remain a servant of the Republic. When the Treaty of Paris was signed in September 1783, formally ending the war and recognizing American independence, Washington prepared to do something that seemed unthinkable to observers around the world. He would resign his commission and return to private life. Officers in European armies did not simply walk away from power. Generals who commanded successful revolutions usually crowned themselves, established dynasties, became the new rulers of the nations they had liberated. But Washington had never wanted to be a king, had never sought power for its own sake. On December 23, 1783, Washington appeared before Congress in Annapolis and resigned his commission, returning the authority they had given him 8 years earlier. He spoke briefly, his voice shaking with emotion he rarely allowed others to see, thanking the Congress and the Army, acknowledging the support of France, and then stepping down from the role that had defined him for nearly a decade. Then he rode home to Mount Vernon, arriving on Christmas Eve to the life he had left behind, to Martha and the quiet rhythms of planting and harvest, to the simple hope that he could finally rest. The world watched in amazement. King George III, when told that Washington would resign and return to his farm, said it was the greatest act of the age, that if Washington did that, he would be the greatest man in the world. Because everyone understood what it meant, that the revolution had succeeded not just in winning independence, but in establishing a principle that power comes from the people and returns to them, that leaders serve at their consent and step down when the service is complete. Washington had won the war, but more importantly, he had won it in a way that preserved the ideals it was fought for. And now, he thought, he could finally be the man he had always wanted to be, a farmer, a husband, a private citizen in a free country. He had no way of knowing that the nation would call him back one more time, that the greatest test of his leadership was still ahead. Mount Vernon in the spring of 1784 was everything Washington had dreamed about during the long years of war. The Potomac flowed past his land with the same steady rhythm it had carried since his childhood, and the fields awaited planting with the promise of harvest. He rose early each morning, rode out to inspect his farms, made notes on crop rotations and improvements, threw himself into the work of restoring an estate that had suffered from his long absence. Martha was beside him again, and the house filled with visiting family, with the ordinary pleasures of domestic life that war had denied him. For a brief time, it seemed he might actually have the retirement he had earned. But the country Washington had fought to create was stumbling. The Articles of Confederation, the document that loosely bound the 13 states together, was proving inadequate to the task of governing a nation. Congress had no power to tax, no ability to regulate commerce between states, no mechanism to enforce its decisions. The states bickered like jealous neighbors, each pursuing its own interests with little regard for the collective good. Debts from the war went unpaid, soldiers who had fought for independence found themselves impoverished, and the unity that had existed during the struggle against Britain was fracturing into regional disputes and economic chaos. Washington watched from Mount Vernon with growing concern. He had not fought for 8 years to see the nation collapse into petty squabbling, had not sacrificed so much to watch the experiment in self-government fail before it truly began. He wrote letters to friends expressing his frustration, warning that without a stronger central government, the Union would dissolve and the states would become prey to foreign powers who would exploit their divisions. But he resisted calls to involve himself directly, believing he had done his part and that others should now step forward to solve the problems of peace. Then came Shays' Rebellion in 1786, an uprising of farmers in Massachusetts who were being crushed by debt and taxes, who took up arms against the state government in desperation. The rebellion was eventually put down, but it shocked Washington and others who had believed that the revolution had created a stable foundation. If citizens were rebelling against their own government just a few years after independence, what did that say about the republic they had fought to establish? The rebellion crystallized Washington's fear that without stronger federal authority, the nation would descend into anarchy or fracture into separate countries that would inevitably war against each other. When delegates from the states convened in Philadelphia in May 1787 for a constitutional convention, ostensibly to revise the Articles of Confederation, Washington was chosen as Virginia's delegate and, inevitably, as president of the convention. He had not wanted to attend, had hoped to remain at Mount Vernon, but the weight of expectation was too great. His presence would lend legitimacy to the proceedings, would signal that the convention was serious and important. And so he returned to Philadelphia, to the same city where he had accepted command of the Continental Army 12 years earlier, to help create something that had never existed before, a federal republic that balanced the sovereignty of states with the power of a central government. The convention met through the hot summer of 1787, delegates arguing behind closed doors about representation and slavery, about executive power and the judiciary, about fundamental questions of how free people should govern themselves. Washington said little during the debates, presiding over the proceedings with the same quiet authority he had brought to military command. His silence was strategic. He did not want to impose his views, did not want to use his enormous prestige to shut down debate. But his presence mattered, lending gravity to the discussions, reminding delegates that they were engaged in something sacred, that the document they were creating would shape not just their generation but all the ones to come. The debates were often contentious. Small states feared domination by large states. Southern states insisted on protections for slavery, refusing to join any union that threatened the institution on which their economy depended. Northern delegates were disgusted by slavery but willing to compromise to preserve the Union. The question of how to elect a president consumed days of argument. Should Congress choose the people directly? Some indirect method that balanced popular will with stability? They compromised, as they had to, creating a document that was imperfect but workable, that established three branches of government with checks and balances, that created a presidency with real power but also real limitations. They punted on slavery, the moral catastrophe at the heart of the nation, preserving it through carefully neutral language that allowed the institution to continue while pretending the Constitution was not endorsing it. It was a failure that would haunt the nation for decades, that would eventually require another war to resolve, but in that moment, the delegates believed that union was more important than immediate justice, that creating a stable government was the prerequisite for addressing other wrongs. On September 17, 1787, the delegates signed the Constitution and sent it to the states for ratification. Washington signed first, his name large and clear at the top of the document, and in that signature was a kind of promise, that he believed in what they had created, that he was willing to stake his reputation on this untested experiment in Republican government. The ratification debates that followed were fierce. Many Americans feared that the Constitution created a government too powerful, too reminiscent of the monarchy they had just escaped. The Anti-Federalists argued eloquently for preserving state sovereignty, for maintaining the weak central government of the Articles. But the Federalists, led by Madison and Hamilton and others, argued just as passionately that only a stronger union could preserve the liberty that independence had won. Washington watched the ratification debates from Mount Vernon, refusing to campaign publicly but writing private letters to allies, urging support for the Constitution. His endorsement mattered enormously. People who might have opposed the document were willing to support it because Washington had signed it, because they trusted that he would not lend his name to something that would endanger the liberties they had fought for. By June 1788, enough states had ratified to bring the Constitution into effect, and attention turned immediately to the question of who would serve as the first president. There was never really any doubt. Washington was the only choice that could unite the fractured nation, the only man trusted by North and South, by Federalists and Anti-Federalists, by soldiers and civilians. The Electoral College, meeting for the first time in early 1789, cast their votes unanimously for George Washington as president. He received word at Mount Vernon in April, and the familiar weight settled back onto his shoulders, duty calling once more, the nation asking him to serve when he wanted nothing more than to remain in the peace he had finally found. He traveled to New York, the temporary capital, in late April, and the journey became a procession of celebration. Towns along the route decorated their streets, crowds gathered to see him pass, children threw flowers beneath his horse's hooves. It was adulation that made him deeply uncomfortable, this worship that felt too close to the monarchical reverence Americans had just rejected. But he understood that the people needed symbols, needed to see in him the embodiment of the revolution's success, and so he accepted the tribute with grace while privately dreading what it represented. On April 30, 1789, Washington took the oath of office on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York, his hand resting on a Bible, promising to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. He was 57 years old, his hair now white, his face marked by years of responsibility and loss. He spoke briefly to the assembled crowd and then to Congress, his voice barely audible, his nervousness evident despite decades of public service. This role was different from commanding an army. There was no precedent, no manual, no history to guide him. Every decision he made would become tradition, every action would set expectations for all who followed. Washington approached the presidency with the same methodical care he had applied to everything in his life. He needed to assemble a cabinet, to appoint officials who could build the administrative structure of the new government. He chose carefully, seeking men of talent regardless of their political views. Thomas Jefferson became Secretary of State, brilliant and idealistic, a man who had written the Declaration of Independence and who believed deeply in limited government and the rights of states. Alexander Hamilton became Secretary of the Treasury, equally brilliant but with a very different vision. He wanted a strong central government, a national bank, an economy built on commerce and manufacturing rather than agriculture. The tension between Jefferson and Hamilton would define Washington's presidency, a fundamental disagreement about what kind of nation America should become. Jefferson saw an agrarian republic of independent farmers, suspicious of cities and banks and concentrated power. Hamilton saw an industrial and commercial nation that could compete with European powers, that needed strong institutions and financial systems to thrive. They were both patriots, both served the nation they had helped create, but their visions were incompatible, and Washington found himself constantly mediating between them, trying to chart a middle course that preserved the Union while allowing both philosophies room to develop. The first years of Washington's presidency were consumed with practical matters, establishing the functions of government, creating departments and systems, dealing with the massive debt left from the Revolutionary War. Hamilton proposed an ambitious financial plan. The federal government would assume state debts, establish a national bank, and fund the debt through taxes and bonds. Jefferson and Madison opposed it, seeing in Hamilton's plans a concentration of power that threatened Republican principles. The debates grew heated, factions forming that would eventually become the first political parties, though Washington despised the very idea of parties, believing they would divide the nation into warring camps. Washington mediated a compromise. Hamilton got his financial system in exchange for agreeing that the permanent capital would be located on the Potomac River in the South, a symbolic balance between northern commercial interests and southern agricultural power. It was the kind of practical deal-making that kept the government functioning, but it left Washington exhausted by the constant need to balance competing visions, to prevent the young nation from tearing itself apart over philosophical differences. Foreign affairs added another layer of complexity. In 1789, revolution erupted in France, and Americans watched with mixed feelings as their former ally descended into chaos. Jefferson and his followers saw the French Revolution as a continuation of the spirit of 1776, a people throwing off tyranny and claiming their rights. Hamilton and his supporters saw mob violence and the collapse of order, a warning of what happened when revolution went too far. When France and Britain went to war in 1793, both sides expected American support, but Washington declared neutrality, refusing to be drawn into a European conflict that would drain the young nation's resources and potentially destroy it. The Neutrality Proclamation enraged Jefferson, who believed America owed France support for their help during the Revolutionary War. But Washington was firm. The nation was too weak, too fragile to survive another war. Neutrality was not cowardice, it was survival, a recognition that independence meant choosing when and where to fight, not being dragged into other nations' conflicts by sentiment or obligation. Jefferson resigned from the cabinet in frustration, convinced that Washington was betraying revolutionary principles, and the split deepened between those who wanted close ties with France and those who preferred Britain. By 1794, the divisions within the country had grown dangerously deep. In western Pennsylvania, farmers rebelled against a federal excise tax on whiskey, a tax Hamilton had pushed through to fund his financial system. The rebels saw the tax as tyranny, as the new federal government acting just like the British Crown had, imposing burdens without consent. They attacked tax collectors, threatened federal authority, and Washington faced his first real test of whether the Constitution could maintain order without descending into the kind of military rule he had spent his life opposing. Washington called up militias from several states, personally led 13,000 troops into western Pennsylvania in a show of federal authority that dwarfed anything the British had sent to suppress colonial resistance. But he handled the Whiskey Rebellion with careful restraint. He wanted to demonstrate that the government could enforce its laws, but he did not want to create martyrs or turn legitimate grievances into permanent rebellion. The show of force was enough. The rebellion collapsed without significant violence, the ringleaders were arrested, and Washington eventually pardoned them, believing that mercy after the demonstration of power would win more lasting loyalty than punishment. The message was clear: the federal government had the strength to maintain order, but it would use that strength judiciously, with restraint and ultimate forgiveness. It was Washington's philosophy of leadership distilled into policy: be firm but not cruel, demonstrate authority but temper it with compassion, and always remember that the purpose of power is to serve the people, not to dominate them. Through all of this, Washington longed for Mount Vernon. The presidency exhausted him in ways that military command never had. War had been simpler, there were enemies to fight, clear objectives to achieve. But politics was endless compromise, navigating between factions that both claimed to represent the true spirit of the revolution, making decisions that pleased no one fully but kept the nation functioning. He had accepted a second term in 1792 only because everyone believed the country still needed him, but he made clear that he would not serve a third term, that 8 years was enough, that the presidency must not become another kind of monarchy where one man held power until death. In 1796, as his second term neared its end, Washington prepared his farewell address, a document that summarized everything he had learned about governing a republic. He warned against political parties, believing they would divide the nation into hostile factions more interested in defeating each other than serving the common good. He urged Americans to preserve the Union above all else, to resist the sectional divisions between North and South that threatened to pull the country apart. He advocated for neutrality in foreign affairs, arguing that America should trade with all nations but enter permanent alliances with none, that the country needed time to grow strong before entangling itself in the conflicts of older powers. The farewell address was published in newspapers across the country in September 1796, and it became one of the founding documents of American political culture, quoted and referenced for generations as a statement of principles from the man who had led the nation from its birth. Washington did not deliver it as a speech, he simply released it to the press and let his words speak for themselves, as he had always preferred action over rhetoric, substance over performance. In March 1797, Washington attended the inauguration of John Adams as the second President of the United States, and the peaceful transfer of power from one elected leader to another was itself a revolutionary act. Monarchies passed power through blood. Military dictatorships held power through force. But here, in this young republic, a leader who had saved the nation twice, once in war, once in peace, was voluntarily stepping down, returning power to the people who had temporarily granted it to him. Washington sat in the audience while Adams took the oath, and observers noted that Washington seemed more relieved than Adams seemed happy, as if a burden Washington had carried for decades was finally being lifted from his shoulders. He returned to Mount Vernon in the spring of 1797, and this time it was truly a retirement. He was 65 years old, tired in body and spirit, ready to spend whatever time remained to him in the simple pleasures of home. He managed his farms, entertained the constant stream of visitors who made pilgrimages to see him, wrote letters to friends scattered across the young nation. He watched the political battles continue, Adams struggling with many of the same challenges Washington had faced, Hamilton and Jefferson's philosophical war growing more bitter, but he remained on the sidelines, refusing to be drawn back into public life no matter how urgently people claimed they needed him. The last years at Mount Vernon were not easy. His body ached from decades of hard use, old wounds and illnesses catching up with him. His teeth, which had troubled him all his adult life, were mostly gone, replaced by uncomfortable dentures made from various materials, none of them satisfactory. He walked his farms with the slower pace of age, still observing everything, still planning improvements, but feeling the weight of years in every step. He thought often about his legacy, about what he had helped create and what would survive him. He had owned enslaved people his entire adult life, had built his wealth on their labor, and in his final years he struggled with the moral contradiction between the liberty he had fought for and the bondage he had maintained. He could not fully escape the prejudices of his time and class, could not see enslaved people as complete equals, but he had grown uncomfortable enough with the institution to order in his will that his enslaved workers be freed upon Martha's death. It was a limited, flawed gesture that did not erase the injustice of their bondage during his lifetime, but it suggested that even Washington, in his last days, recognized that the revolution he had led was incomplete, that the promise of liberty would have to extend further than his generation had been willing to take it. On December 12, 1799, Washington rode out to inspect his farms in cold, wet weather. Snow mixed with rain, the kind of raw weather that chills to the bone, but he stayed out for hours, refusing to let discomfort interrupt his routines. By that evening he had developed a sore throat, and through the night it worsened. By morning he could barely breathe, his throat swelling closed, his lungs filling with fluid. The doctors were called, and they applied the treatments of the time, bloodletting, blistering, medicines that did nothing to help and likely hastened his decline. Washington knew he was dying. He faced it with the same calm acceptance he had brought to every other crisis in his life, giving instructions for his burial, apologizing to the doctors for the trouble he was causing them, asking Martha to bring his 2 wills so he could choose which one to keep. Through that final day, December 14th, he struggled for breath, his body failing but his mind clear until nearly the end. As night fell, he died quietly, surrounded by family and servants, his hand in Martha's, slipping away from the world he had done so much to shape. The news of Washington's death moved across the nation like a wave of grief, carried by riders who spread the word from town to town, from farmhouse to city, reaching into every corner of the young republic. In Philadelphia, Congress draped itself in black. In churches across 13 states, bells tolled in slow, mournful rhythm. People who had never met him wept as if they had lost a father, because in many ways they had. Washington had been the constant presence through every crisis, the steady hand that had guided them from rebellion to nationhood, the living proof that their experiment in self-government could work. Henry Lee, his old comrade from the Revolutionary War, captured it in words that would echo through American memory: first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. It was simple eulogy, but it held the truth of what Washington had meant to the people he had served. He had led them through the impossible war, had shaped the government that emerged from it, and had done so with a character that earned not just respect but genuine affection. What Washington left behind was not merely a nation, but a set of principles embedded in the foundations of how that nation would govern itself. He had established the precedent that military power serves civilian authority, that generals do not become kings, that the sword is wielded only at the direction of the people. When he resigned his commission in 1783, he had shown the world that Republican virtue was not just a philosophical ideal but a lived reality. When he stepped down after 2 terms as president, he established the tradition that power is temporary, that leaders serve and then return to citizenship, that no one is indispensable to the republic. These were not small gifts. Throughout history, revolutions had ended with new tyrannies, with liberators becoming oppressors, with chaos giving way to dictators who promised order but delivered only different forms of bondage. Washington could have taken power for himself, his soldiers would have followed him, the people would have accepted him, the Congress would have been powerless to stop him. But he understood something that many revolutionary leaders never grasp, that the cause matters more than the man, that institutions outlast individuals, that true greatness lies not in seizing power but in knowing when to let it go. His flaws were real and significant. He owned human beings as property, participated in a system of racial oppression that contradicted every principle the revolution claimed to champion. He could be vain about his reputation, thin-skinned about criticism, and rigid in his adherence to protocol and hierarchy. He was not a brilliant political philosopher like Jefferson, not a creative genius like Hamilton, not an eloquent orator or a writer of soaring prose. What he possessed instead was steadiness, judgment, and an almost superhuman capacity for self-discipline, the ability to subordinate his personal desires to what he believed duty required. Mount Vernon would remain in his family for generations, eventually becoming a shrine visited by millions who wanted to walk where he walked, to stand in the rooms where he made decisions that shaped history. The nation would grow beyond anything he could have imagined, spreading across a continent, industrializing, fighting a civil war that finally confronted the contradiction of slavery, emerging as a global power that would have been unthinkable to the farmers and merchants of 1776. And through all of it, Washington's example would remain as a touchstone, a reminder of what leadership can be when it is grounded in service rather than ambition. The monuments would come later, the capital city bearing his name, the marble obelisk rising above it, his face carved into mountains and printed on currency. But the real monument was always the republic itself, the fact that it survived and grew and adapted, that the experiment in self-government did not collapse into anarchy or harden into tyranny. He was a man, not a myth, though myth-making began even before his death and continued long after. The truth of him is found not in the stories of cherry trees and perfect virtue, but in the records of his struggles, the letters where he doubted himself, the battles where he made mistakes, the compromises where he sacrificed principle for necessity, the moments when he chose duty over desire again and again until it became the defining pattern of his life. The boy who stood by the Potomac River watching water flow toward an unknown future had become the man who gave that future its shape. He did not do it alone, thousands fought beside him in war, brilliant minds collaborated with him in crafting the Constitution, allies and rivals both contributed to building the nation. But his role was unique, irreplaceable in the moment even if the republic he helped create would eventually grow beyond any single person's influence. Tonight, as his story ends and sleep beckons, remember that Washington's greatest gift was not genius but perseverance, not brilliance but reliability, not perfection but the willingness to serve despite imperfection. He was a man who learned from his failures, who grew wiser through experience, who understood that leadership is not about being the smartest person in the room but about earning the trust of everyone in it. The stars that hung over Mount Vernon on the night he died are the same stars that shine now, distant and unchanging while the world below transforms with each passing generation. Washington returned to the earth that had shaped him, to the Virginia soil he had surveyed as a boy and cultivated as a man, his story complete but its echoes continuing through all the years that followed. And so we leave him there, in the quiet of a December night 2 centuries past, the general who would not be king, the president who set the nation on its path, the man who rose to meet history's call and then stepped aside so that history could continue without him. His example remains, not perfect, not without shadow, but profound in its demonstration that power can be wielded justly, that duty can triumph over ambition, that a republic can survive if its leaders remember they are servants, not masters. Rest well in the knowledge of his story, and let it carry you gently toward sleep, toward dreams where courage is quiet and heroism is measured not in the seizing of power but in the wisdom to surrender it, where greatness is defined not by what we take but by what we give, and where the truest monument to any life is not marble or myth, but the enduring principles that outlive us all. Good night.